I think of, the biology, which is really related to genetics, epigenetics, general health. That's a huge component of the addiction spectrum. Plus stress, which causes epigenetics, causes the environmental change. So stress, especially trauma, early childhood trauma. Plus drug. So whatever medicine or drug, if it's a pain pill, if it's heroin, if it's, cocaine, if it's alcohol, the combination of those three equals a formula that puts people at risk for addiction.
I have to double and triple down on early childhood trauma because nearly every single patient who walks into my clinic has been the victim of neglect or abuse. There's been history of trauma in their life, and it really imprints physical changes onto their health in a way that I don't think most people appreciate.
Welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm Kirkland Newman, and if you, your loved ones, or clients suffer from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor memory, poor attention, mood swings, exhaustion, etc., I interview the leading integrative mental health practitioners from around the world to help you understand the root causes of these symptoms, many of which may surprise you and suggest solutions to help you heal. If you like this interview, please do subscribe and forward to others who might find it helpful. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. Thank you both very, very much for being here for the Mind Health 360 show. I'm really excited to have you both because addiction is a real fascination of mine. My grandmother was an alcoholic and she committed suicide, in fact, when my mother was 15. And so that's had huge repercussions on my life, on my children's life. I had postpartum depression. I think a lot of that had to do maybe with the sort of generational impact of that suicide on my life, on my mother's life, on my kids' life. And so, addiction is a very personal thing to me. And I know that so many people suffer, and it's not just the people who suffer from addiction, it's also their families, their sort of communities, etc. And you guys know this better than anyone. You're on the front line of treating addiction. And so I just want to introduce you. First of all, I want to thank you both for being here on a Sunday especially, but also I want to introduce both of you before we start. So Dr. Podesta, Dr. Arwen Podesta, you are a board-certified adult psychiatrist with subspecializations in addiction medicine, forensic psychiatry, and integrative and holistic medicine. You have a background in biochemistry, complementary medicine, and massage therapy. Now, that is very rare.
Very rare.
Yeah. You graduated from University of Southern California, Keck School of Medicine, and then moved to New Orleans for a psychiatry residence at Louisiana State University, where you pursued a fellowship in forensic psychiatry at Tulane University. After Hurricane Katrina, you were involved with psychiatric care for the most needy and disenfranchised, which must have been quite something. And you've worked in the public sector as medical director of ACER, and you consult with Orleans Criminal Court Intervention, which is a drug court, and Municipal Court Diversion Services. You were also chair and co-creator of the New Orleans Forensic Mental Health Coalition, and you're a strong advocate for enabling public access to holistic mental health and addiction treatment and rational prescribing practices, which I think is very important. You are Tulane clinical faculty. You're also on a dissertation committee at UTH Dallas and teach at the NOPD Academy. You were nominated president of the Louisiana chapter of the American Society of Addiction Medicine in 2017. And you founded Podesta Psychiatry in 2012. You've been voted into New Orleans Magazine Top Doctors every year since then. You're a well-renowned speaker and travel to teach and speak on the subjects of addiction med and integrative psychiatry. So Dr. Mather is a board-certified family practice physician who practices functional medicine in New Orleans, Louisiana. You graduated from Tulane University School of Medicine and Tulane University School of Public Health in 2011 and completed your residency in 2014. In your medical practice, you focus on delivering cost-effective and practical functional medicine with a focus on GI health and mold toxicity. You spend a lot of time working with patients suffering from complex diseases and helping patients to optimize their longevity. Now, the reason this is so interesting, I think, is because one of my personal pet interests is the integrative side of addiction medicine. So what I wanted to do is bring you both together to discuss how you work together in addiction psychiatry, how you help people who are suffering from the disease of addiction, and do it from a more integrative perspective. I think before we start on that, we can look at some of the numbers. I mean, addiction is a huge, huge issue. And I don't know if you have the stats at your fingertips, but certainly in your book, Hooked, which in fact I should have mentioned because Dr. Podesta has written a wonderful book called Hooked, which is all about addiction, sort of the causes of addiction and how to heal addiction. You mentioned that 24 million Americans are suffering from addiction problems, that Americans consume more than 80% of all the ADHD, anti-anxiety, and pain pills in the world, that 1 out of 10 individuals will have a serious substance abuse in his or her lifetime, and that 3 of us is impacted by addiction. Now, those are US numbers, but I'm sure that they're not very different in the UK and other parts of the world, unfortunately.
Yes, and I want to just make sure that we hear that those numbers are reflective in the population in almost every country, in almost every westernized country.
Absolutely. And so, really terrible numbers. The other shocking statistics from your book to me was that, treatment centers, rehab centers, 12-step programs, all of the sort of usual treatment approaches only have between a sort of 30 to 50% success rate most of the time. Some will go as high, you mentioned, as 75%, but even so, that's over a period of, say, 3 to 6 to 12 months, possibly 5 years, but then there's a very high relapse rate. And you talk a lot about how addiction is a chronic disease and a brain disease and a chronic disease. So given those numbers, which are quite depressing in some ways, there needs to be a sort of rethink of how we treat addiction. And I think one of the things I really love about you two as a tag team is that I think you address that need to rethink in a really creative and interesting way. So can you talk through a little bit your approach to addiction and how you think working together and treating addiction with functional medicine is helpful to better patient outcomes?
Yeah, patient outcomes are really, we wouldn't tolerate that in most other disease states, I mean, if we had 60% failure of treatment of other chronic diseases, we wouldn't approve the medication or the type of treatment when it's close to 75 for abstinence only based programs. So in the past 10, 12, 15 years, actually in 2000 in the United States, buprenorphine, an opioid partial agonist medication, was approved for treatment for what we call now medication assisted treatment for opioid addiction. And then methadone's been around since the 50s in most Western societies. And yet, even with those 2 treatments, we've only improved treatment. We've only improved overdose deaths. Actually, we haven't improved overdose deaths because we have a worse problem. We haven't really improved the numbers overall or the success rates. And so when I think about addiction treatment, and in my book, which, by the way, is out of print right now. We're editing it and it'll be back into print in the spring. But I think of, the biology, which is really related to genetics, epigenetics, general health. That's a huge component of the addiction spectrum. Plus stress, which causes epigenetics, causes the environmental change. So stress, especially trauma, early childhood trauma. Plus drug. So whatever medicine or drug, if it's a pain pill, if it's heroin, if it's, cocaine, if it's alcohol, the combination of those 3 equals a formula that puts people at risk for addiction. And so with medication assisted treatment, I can take people off of the drug. With enforcement, we can reduce the number of drugs on the street. Hasn't been successful so far. But we also have to work on the biological approach. And so with the biology, I'm going to defer to Dr. Mather because so frequently these epigenetics, it's a primary care, it's a functional medicine phenomenon, gut health, things that can make people stable. So Joe?
It's wonderful that you get to defer to me because I was going to say that I'm privileged to be able to work with, a world-class expert in psychiatry and mental health. So it's really nice because as after listening to Kiki, your interviews, I mean, you're able to go incredibly in a lot of biochemical detail, and it just explains how much knowledge there is in each field. And the more I learn, the more there is to learn. And so it's wonderful to be able to let Arwen assist with so many of my cases with medical management, with being able to use just the minimum amount of drug to make a difference in a patient. And we can work together as a team to find the underlying causes for their poor mental health. And so we can really take this a number of places, but I have to double and triple down on early childhood trauma, because nearly every single patient who walks into my clinic has been the victim of neglect or abuse. There's been a history of trauma in their life, and it really imprints physical changes onto their health in a way that I don't think most people appreciate. We can also dive into how profound fixing and altering someone's gut and GI health is. It's one of the most amazing things that I never expected before doing functional medicine, how effective treating someone's gut health is. It's amazing to watch, just being able to pull people off antidepressants that they've been on for decades. And then finally, the things that we're really trying to look for are what are the toxins that are causing direct damage and inflammatory changes into the brain. And we see metals here in Louisiana. Mold is just a huge culprit in so much mental health. And this takes a team. For the chronically ill patients who failed out of multiple doctors, it takes multiple people utilizing their skills to the highest level to get them better. So why I'm lucky to be able to rely so much on Arwen. Yeah.
And vice versa. I mean, I think it's very important to have this team approach. And one of the things that I'm a big advocate of is, if I have friends who have been in rehab treatments, et cetera, and one of the things that always surprises me is the lack of attention to the biochemistry. And so there is a lot of, there are 12-step programs, there's a lot of therapy, there's some trauma therapy, and I agree that trauma therapy is incredibly key. But there's very little in terms of nutrition, in terms of amino acid therapy, in terms of looking at the things with, for instance, the gut or the toxins, as you mentioned. And that always surprises me. And I wonder if the high relapse rates are partly due to the fact that the biochemistry is not supported. And so, a friend of mine who used to be a heroin addict, he had very low cholesterol, almost non-existent. And we know that cholesterol is super important for brain health. And I think I'm no expert, but a lot of addiction has to do with, you mentioned mental health a lot, Dr. Mather. And a lot of addiction, I think, has to do with self-medication of states that are very uncomfortable, depression, anxiety, insomnia, mental states that are very uncomfortable, that are then self-medicated through substances and behaviors, because we're also talking about behaviors in terms of addiction. And I think if those underlying imbalances, whether they're hormonal or inflammation driven, etc., were addressed, then maybe people would feel better and they would have fewer mental health issues and then less need to self-medicate. I mean, would you say that's accurate? And do you see that in your practice?
100%. And that's in fact why I essentially partnered with Dr. Mather, because there is so much overlap, and these patients have been largely unattended to because, a lot of people with addiction and trauma and psychiatric illness, they don't want to present themselves or talk about their issues or go to get help because they're stigmatized. A lot of physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs, the medical community really shuns people that struggle with both mental illness and addiction. And so the stigma's there. So they feel stigmatized. I've heard lots of ER doctors say, get these addicts out of my hospital. And that's been a problem. It's changing with a lot of activism on the parts of people like you and me and Joe. But I see so many people that have unmet needs for those that are trying to get help with addiction. And when someone goes to a traditional addiction treatment program, often they don't get blood work drawn. Often they don't have a medical involvement. They don't have even a physical exam. And so frequently, you can imagine someone who's an alcoholic that is cachectic and that has just, very, very poor nutrition. You can imagine someone who is using heroin that also is cachectic, that has abscesses and inflammation and other issues. There's a risk of HIV and hepatitis C and other transmitted diseases. And nutrition is very, very poor in almost everyone that's struggling with addiction. Their first message, their brain's first thing is to get the drug, because that's addiction. And so when someone has been suffering from essentially malnutrition and brain damage, regular drug intake causing brain damage, your friend who has low cholesterol, we're not going to get the brain healed if there aren't the building blocks for the brain in there. And so I first check labs, get people off of the drug, or try to get people off of the drug as best as possible, figure out the comorbidities, and those comorbidities such as medical comorbidities and psychiatric comorbidities, and then start working on each avenue. Just if it's a lab like low vitamin D, that's an easy fix, but it takes at least 3 months to get those levels up, and then people start feeling better. If it's a low zinc or high histamine, or there's loads of reasons that people feel that they don't get a dopamine spike any longer, when they're struggling with addiction, and it could be highly related to gut health. And so, yes, the answer is yes. We really do have limited amount of medicalized functional medicine treatment for those who are really the most disenfranchised, and that's in the medical community, those with addiction and psychiatric illness, in my opinion.
I think, and that's the other problem that you mentioned. I mean, I think, first of all, do you, as a sort of team, do you find that you have better outcomes when you do treat all this biochemistry? And do you find that you can actually measure the results and you have less relapse? First of all, I think that's the first question. Do you actually, are there tangible results with taking this approach?
I'm going to say yes, but we don't have the numbers because we're we're a small team, and and like Dr. Mather, we both have a small number of patients. And so the patients recognize, I've been trying to get treatment for 10 or 15 years, and you're the first one that did this, or this is the first time I feel this way. So I know, Joe, you have loads of good patients.
Well, we're going to have to, I guess, run a study, Arwen.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
I think you should. I mean, patient outcomes are so important to make people, because I mean, I'm such a firm believer in this, and I really think that, rehabs all over the world should be using this approach. I think it's crazy that they're not, and if you look at the biochemistry behind addiction, and maybe you can talk us through that a little bit. In your book, you say that people who have essentially, there are 30 different genes apparently that sort of can predispose you to addiction. And some of these genes will cause you to have low dopamine, or sort of low dopamine tone and low serotonin to start with. And therefore, you're always looking for that dopamine hit to try and feel better, to try and feel normal. And, if you look at the sort of biochemistry of addiction, and you realize that these neurotransmitters and these chemicals that you're low on, you need the building blocks for those. So you need vitamin B6, you need zinc, you need, vitamin B12, folate, you need to be methylating properly. I mean, there are a lot of different things that you need to build those. You need the right proteins, amino acids, you need tyrosine and phenylalanine. I never know how to say that, for dopamine, and, tryptophan for serotonin. And if your diet is insufficient in these, then you're not going to be making the right neurotransmitters. And I think, this is really important. And if you can talk us a little bit, Arwen, about, you say that addiction in your book is essentially, so the biochemistry, which is a combination of genetics and epigenetics, plus stress, plus the drug. And you mentioned trauma, obviously, with the stress. What are the epigenetic factors in addition to the genetic factors? Can you talk us through a little bit about this?
I can do a little bit. There's a lot more. I wrote that book in 2016, and we have had just a whirlwind of new neuroscience. And so we have a little bit better knowledge today than stuff that's in my book. But there's a handful of genes. I mentioned about 30 in my book, but like OPRM1, that's the opiate mu receptor, ANK1, dopamine transporter, GABA, tyrosine hydroxylase, all of those are related to the processing of either an opiate in the brain or of dopamine and dopamine tone. Now, what we know is dopamine is the main neurotransmitter that's most related to the reward cycle in the brain. And so when people have essentially wavering dopamine up and down and it's not steady, then, and because of certain receptors and because of certain mutations, then they may be at risk for when they take a drug, they get a spike in their dopamine and then they get a fall. Instead of spiking and then modulating out into somewhat back to normal, they get a fall. And this could be early in the use of drug, or this could be over time and build over time because of neuroadaptation. That being said, any mutation in any of those pieces of the pathway could be affecting the predilection of addiction. And then stress, as in physical stress, mental stress, trauma, those all, I kind of dumb it down. It's really not exactly right, but I call it the serotonin steal. So anytime you have high cortisol, you're running around, there's oxidative damage going on cellularly. And so all of your precursors for serotonin, all of your precursors for dopamine, all of your micronutrients and trace minerals, zinc, like you said, and vitamins, vitamin B and SAM-E, all of those are stolen to go do the repair of the oxidative damage that's occurring because the cortisol, because the stress. And also epigenetics occurs, turning on or turning off genes related to some of these cycles.
I'll piggyback. It's worse than that, because then the chronic stress will lead directly to leaky gut. So yes, when you have chronic stress, your body will be upregulating cellular defense. So it'll be moving protein towards cellular defense, immunoglobulin production, cytokine production, and it will directly rob the protein stores in the body. And it turns out that the fascia and the connective tissue in the gut holds the largest source of protein. And so what you do is you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. And so you're taking protein away from the gut to upregulate defense. As a result, you get leaky gut, more infection, more inflammation, more reactivity. And so often our job when Arwen and I first get a patient is, okay, so we have all of these issues. Where are the places where we can start putting our fingers in the dike, stopping the leak? How can we get this boat floating a little bit more? Because we have all of these destructive processes. How do we take a step back, and what is the most efficient way that we can get this patient better? I see frequently for patients with lower grade psychiatric or mental health disorders, simply cleaning up the gut is just such a practical, cost-effective way to get people better. And it's not, I would say probably 50% of the patients who come in to my clinic with a functional GI disorder like SIBO or a bacterial dysbiosis or yeast infection, maybe 50% of those who are on antidepressants are off antidepressants maybe 6 months in. So just goes to show that sometimes simple therapies can really make a big deal.
There's a sort of dynamic between the gut and addiction in the sense that, if you have an unhealthy gut, it can affect your neurotransmitters, many of which are made in the gut. And there's a huge link, obviously, as we know, through the vagus nerve between the gut and the brain. But equally, if you take substances such as benzos, etc., they can also damage your gut. And so there's a sort of bi-directional thing. And I think it's so important, especially in addiction medicine, to really heal the gut, both because it can help avoid sort of depression, anxiety in the first place, but also if you have been using these drugs, it can really damage your gut and then create a vicious cycle.
Even in the formal psychiatric literature, you can search for the gut-brain axis, and you'll start to see paper pop up, and you'll start to see people citing the health of the microbial diversity in published papers. And so I think the field is actually catching up pretty quickly to this, and this understanding is definitely new.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, one of the next podcasts I'm going to do is on the gut because it is such an important topic. And there's no doubt. And the thing with the gut, which is crazy, is that, there have been something like 50,000 research papers published on it since 1987, I think. And yet it's still not in mainstream medicine. But, the research is there, the science is there. And I think that's where we need to catch up a bit.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, a little last plug for that too, because I think here we have so much science on it. We are, the genome of all of the trillions of bacteria in the gut, of which there are many hundreds of thousands of types, is being almost completed. And so we're looking at the microbiota genome, and it's so fascinating. And then figuring out how we can use that genome, just like understanding our own genome. How that affects our physical and mental health. Our body is like a planet, and there's as many gut bacteria as there are humans on the planet. And so how profound that affects your physical environment, your physical being. And so I just think that having all of that science is going to be great. My medical students that I've seen, they are learning it, but not that much, because again, medical school teaches the things that are taught in medical school. And so it's slow to make changes, but it is being talked about. And I think the research will really pan out. Gut-brain axis mental health and mental wellness for our really close near future.
Fantastic.
Like the lowest hanging fruit. And so when Joe says put the finger in the dike, I think of the Hoover Dam, but it having 55 holes in it. And where can we get the most effect by plugging one of the holes first? First, I have to take them off of the drug and get them out of the lifestyle so they're not chronically beating down their system. Then we have to build up the immunity and address the damage. And so much of medicine, addiction, and psychiatry in particular, at least that's how I feel, that's what I work on, is treatment and maintenance, but not repair. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the missing piece. And that's what Joe is such an expert at, is the repair, the neural repair, the oxidative damage repair, the gut repair. And then we can make a person whole and elevate them to feeling well, instead of just, I have so many patients that white knuckle it through sobriety and they think they're doing great, but they feel like crap. And those are the ones we worry about over the long haul.
100%. And I like that term, white knuckling through sobriety, because I think there is a lot of that going on, and especially in the wonderful 12-step program, which is life-saving for so many. But there is this sense that unless you're healing the underlying biochemistry, and if there is a lot of neuroinflammation going on and a lot of cortisol and a lot of hormone imbalances, etc., people are going to feel like crap. And so, they're going to be depressed and they're going to be anxious, and their brain chemistry is not going to be optimal. And so I know that, Arwen, you work with, quite a few pharmaceuticals in order to sort of stabilize their brain chemistry while they neurally regenerate. But I think also, if you can work with the gut and with healing the gut and healing inflammation and reducing toxins, that will make people feel so much better, so that then it'll be easier to stay sober. I mean, I presume that's sort of the mechanism.
Just having the mental fortitude, because addiction, it is a chronic relapsing disease. We know that. Let's take away the cravings, which I can do with medicine. We can do with some supplements, decrease the cravings with some supplements, but then give them mental fortitude so that they're not driven by their midbrain. They're not driven by their animalistic brain to make, rather than have a decision made by the midbrain or kind of the gut brain even. Let's make a rational intellectual decision regarding, the relapse. And people don't relapse if they're in recovery and they have their midbrain, their intellectual brain kind of overriding their midbrain because of being stable.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because you say at some point addiction hijacks the executive function, the intellectual brain, so the prefrontal cortex, and presumably then sets the limbic system loose to make decisions on the patient's behalf. And, that's always quite dangerous because you want to ideally be in your sort of executive function, making very organized, rational decisions as opposed to being hijacked by your more emotional brain. And so do you find that what is it specifically? I know that with trauma and stress, it does send us into sort of our limbic system. But what is it biochemically that can also contribute to taking the prefrontal cortex offline, if anything?
Yeah, I'll jump on this one, and I'll start on one of my hobby horses, which is mold toxicity. It is amazing to me how directly damaging this is to the brain, to the central nervous system, directly to the limbic system. It's fairly easy now to recognize that when a patient comes in and their limbic system is disordered. They're really heightened emotional responses to normal conversations or reactions. And when you see that, you'll see panic out of the blue. You'll see very easily triggered patients. And I think that with these patients, before they can even start to work on the fundamentals to getting back to feeling better, we need to calm the limbic system down. And there are two really excellent programs. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to dive into Annie Hopper's DNRS program. And then Dr. Gupta also has a similar program for calming down the limbic system and amygdala. And it takes some time. So I ask patients to do this daily, 10 minutes to an hour. Different patients are at different places. And it may take 2 to 3 months before a patient's limbic system is sufficiently quiet. But when it's quiet, that's when the frontal lobe can kind of re-engage, and we can start more directly attacking their biochemical issues, their toxic or infectious issues. But sometimes it's really about giving them a place to stand on. And this is one avenue that I think a lot of patients would be wise to look into if they're really having these issues. And if you've had childhood trauma, the chance that you have a predisposition to have your limbic system go offline. It's easier to happen. Smarter than people than me will have to tell you why, but I just see it clinically all the time. If you've had early childhood trauma, if you've had abuse, you are more likely to go down this pathway where you need specific work on your limbic system.
On the limbic system. And I think that's absolutely true. I mean, the trauma is a big trigger and causes inflammation in the limbic system. But also you mentioned mold, and I did an interview with Dr. Neil Nathan about mold toxicity. And he was talking a lot about, Annie Hopper and Dr. Gupta in terms of, neural retraining of the limbic system and how important this is. And also of the cell danger response, Robert Navio, where, our cells get turned on into the sort of fight, flight, defense mode, and therefore they're not in repair mode, and they're, and it's a whole sort of perfect storm. And so I think that's really, really important. Obviously, if your prefrontal cortex is offline also, and you're being sort of triggered by your limbic system, you're much more impulsive, and you're less able to resist the temptation to use, for instance.
So practically speaking, it looks like a patient who is living in a moldy environment is continuously having their body stuck in the cell danger response or unable to get to the repair, right? They're continuously being triggered, which is turning down their ability to make rational decisions down in real time. Many of these patients, when you get them out of a moldy environment, it is amazing to me the change in personality, direct shift in a patient's ability to reason, and things that you've told them maybe 5 or 6 times, all of a sudden it's, oh, now I understand why you're telling me that, doctor. Fully understand. And it's fascinating to me how direct a neurotoxin mold can be.
Well, this is the fascinating thing. And I mean, this is what frustrates me about addiction treatment generally is that, it can be something like mold, or it can be something like a, major hormonal imbalance or a big toxin. And yet, and it's making, in some ways, it causes and perpetuates addiction. And yet nobody's treating that, nobody's talking about that. And I think that's so important. I have another question when it comes to sort of trauma and stress. There is a sort of controversy controversy in the addiction world. I know that Gabor Mate and several people who sort of talk about the nervous system and trauma and stress in addiction will have the sort of belief that if you treat the trauma and if you treat the stress and and if you deal with that addiction can be pretty much over, that it's not a relapsing disease. And I know that in the addiction community, this is very controversial and not very welcome. So I just wanted to ask you about this.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's really important to note because, what we have with our traditional treatment, we have some people that just do great with 12-step, with therapy, and they do great. And they can be advocates for not putting people on medication or not doing a harm reduction standpoint or not doing some of the other work. But if you look at those that came back from Vietnam, the numbers, I think it was, I'm blanking on the name of the author of this paper, but the numbers were, if we get everyone back from war that has been put on methamphetamine, it was so common to be on methamphetamine in Vietnam. And then also a lot of folks came back on heroin or pain pills because of some pain and other things. And they're frightened and they're, high stress. And so close to, I want to say, I'm blanking on the numbers, but somewhere above 80%, but below 90% of people reacclimated and got off of their medications and off of their drug and out of the addictive lifestyle with reacclimating with therapy or with lifestyle change, not necessarily therapy back then. But look at our veterans that are still suffering from that time frame, that still, I see the ones that are in and out of jail and that are in and out of rehab, and they're still suffering. And then I do a family history and I learned that their genetics are ripe. Mom died of opioid pain pill overdose. Dad has cirrhosis of the liver, or, grandparents died, or, there was suicide in their remote family. So yes, Gabor Mate, I love his work. He's fabulous and brilliant. And there are so many useful tools for that, but one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah.
And for those that it fails hard. And it is because there is a set of folks that have an underlying genetic predilection. And even if they have, I've worked in the public sector for free care of those that are indigent. I've worked in the jail and court systems. And I also worked at a very high function, a place where it was mostly people that came for discrete evening time addiction treatment that was medication based. 80% of those that came were still working to that place. We're still working full time, didn't have much trauma in their life, but they had a ripe family history of addiction. And when they took, and it was mostly opioids at the time, when they took a pain pill for the first time, most of them were pain pills. Some went down the path of heroin eventually. When they took the pain pill for the first time, they found this this euphoria, but also this elated energy that they didn't have in childhood. They never had when they were growing up. And when they took this, they were like, oh, I can work more. I can be more effective. I can go to law school. I can finish business school. I can run my job. I can make it through medical school. Those are the folks we were treating. High achievers that were probably falling into a subset of genetics related to undermethylation. And so that being said, we were missing the target. Therapy wasn't going to help them. If we did the medication management, it helped them tremendously. So that's that small subset though.
So interesting. I think a lot of these controversies in integrative functional medicine in the addiction world comes down to the fact that we all have different specialties and abilities. We all see different patients, right? Yeah. And so even though Arwen and I work closely in the same city, my general bias is not much liking methylation because I hadn't seen it make a great impact on a lot of my patients until Arwen and I started working together. Arwen's patients do react much better to methylation chemistry than my patients. And so I think a lot of it is we all have to be honest about seeing our individual patients, and they all have individual biochemistries, and different patients are going to react differently to our treatments. So the best clinicians are the ones watching their own patient's response.
And I think that's the beauty of integrative and functional medicine is it is personalized medicine. And it really takes each individual patient and says, okay, what is their background? What is their biochemistry? What are all the factors that are impacting their mental health? And and let's deal with those. In terms of methylation and undermethylation, can you just talk us through how that works, and its impact on neurotransmitters, I guess, its impact on reducing dopamine, would it be, so that, you have a tendency to run low on dopamine, or how does that work?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm working with the William Walsh Protocol. I just completed his advanced training, and so we talk a lot about that because in depression, and a lot of depression overlaps with addiction. He'll say about 40% of those with depression have such an undermethylated profile. And that could be genetic, epigenetic, could be a load of reasons. But essentially, undermethylation relates to decreased activity of serotonin and dopamine receptors, not the molecules themselves, but sometimes the molecules as well. And also increase NMDA receptor activity, as in glutamate. And so there's a lot of folks that have addiction that overlaps with that sort of underlying epigenetic or genetic profile. And so it's a lot of high achievers, which is why when I mentioned the place that I was doing the discrete, high functioning treatment, it was, most people were high functioning overachievers that also had a predilection for addiction. And when they took that pill or that drug, they just got that heck yeah, kind of, or, one of my therapists says F yeah when he's talking about this, I mean, it's just this mind-blowing thing. And so it can be related to a whole bunch of other characterological variants. But what we know is that treating methylation in those folks, possibly, and Joe, I'm changing my tune some on some of this because I see a lot of patients that do, when I try to just pump up the methylation with an activated folate, then a lot of folks do turn up their norepinephrine too high, and then they end up in the anxiety state.
Yeah.
And so really focusing on like SAMe and methionine, and then also some calming agents to help the cycle, but maybe not flood the methylation pathway.
Can I throw out two thoughts? So two clinical observations are, one, a patient can be undermethylated. You can give them methylation support and they can do well in the short term, then become overmethylated. And it's very hard for patients once they take something and it gives them an impact and they see that, oh my God, when I take this methylated B vitamin and methylated folate, I feel great. I've got energy. I'm not depressed. My mood is better. My cravings are gone, right? But what happens is over time, they just do too much and they start, as the methylation levels go up and up and up, they start feeling worse to where then they get activated and they're not sleeping. They're agitated, right? So what was good in the beginning may not be good at a higher dose. Is Neil Nathan, what's good at a low dose may just be good at a low dose. Higher is not better, necessarily.
It's where, we're not fixed. Like our brain is not fixed. You put something in, you change your lifestyle, your behavior, your intake, your activity, you have epigenetic changes. And so you may not need that thing. And that's the conversation I think that's the hardest with patients that start on Adderall, for example, and they feel great at first, or start on a pain pill and they feel great at first, or start on a supplement and they feel great at first. And then we need to constantly check in and make some changes, because it's a point in time. We're not, although this addiction's a chronic disease, it's not a chronic, constant, same
changing
fixed state.
Absolutely. And do you do genetic testing to test, for instance, for the MTHFR gene, to test for methylation in terms of people's genetics? Is that helpful?
I worked at one place with a mentor Howard Wetzman, who has some nice little videos on YouTube on addiction and the underlying pathway. I worked with him for a while and he developed a really nice panel of genes related to addiction. And I find that I can really, from a clinical relevance, I can usually kind of pull out just from the clinical interview the pertinent pieces. Oh, really? Mom died of a heroin overdose, and you have this aha moment with heroin, and it's probably going to be related to the opioid receptor, mu receptor variant. You have this one reaction to a medication. It's probably going to be related to certain different variants in their genes. However, a lot of genetic testing it's come a long way. And I have some companies, if it's okay, one of the companies that I've been really liking is Intellect's DNA. And they are not just looking at the genes that are related to certain syndromes or predilections of all sorts of things, not just addiction, mental health, BDNF, a slew of other pathways, both physical and mental disease states or predilections. They also are looking at it from a holistic standpoint of you're not processing, this pathway is set up for being less than optimized because, and so to optimize this pathway, you could take this supplement. So they've put together just an array of thousands of studies that look at not just like, oh, this is an ancestral or an academic study to look at what your genes are, but what can you do to optimize with being the blueprint that you're given? How can we optimize it?
100%. And I think that's so important. And I mean, I think that brings us really to the solutions essentially. And I have a whole number of solutions that I've pulled out of your book. And I'm sure Dr. Mather has a lot of these as well. But I mean, one of the things I really like about your approach is that you combine pharmaceuticals when you need them. And you mentioned that you use certain pharmaceuticals to give the brain a chance for neuroregeneration. And that, 3 to 6 months, you can keep people sort of in a stable place so that they essentially the damage caused by the addictive substances can be repaired. But then there are a lot of natural solutions. So I guess my first question is, given all these natural solutions, which I've taken down, do you think do you see where in the future you would be able to sort of not use any of these pharmaceuticals at all and work with amino acid therapy, for instance? I know that glutamine reduces cravings, and, B6 and zinc and folate can increase serotonin, and, repairing the gut, as Dr. Mather was saying, and using the right amino acids, sort of glutamine, tryptophan, tyrosine, etc. Can you foresee a place where by combining all these different integrative approaches, you could actually avoid using these pharmaceuticals? And my other question is, you mentioned that there is neuroregeneration while using these pharmaceuticals, but, what happens when somebody is on this pharmaceutical? Does the BDNF get boosted? Does the brain regenerate? Because I had read somewhere that lithium is really one of the only neuroregenerative pharmacological interventions, and it's sort of, a natural substance in some sense. So those are two questions in one, which is not super helpful, but anyway.
So I'll jump in first. No, my answer is no. I don't foresee a time unless we can, unless we can really do some fast neural repair. I don't see a time where medication-assisted treatment, particularly for the opioid epidemic, the opioid crisis right now, will not utilize medication. So the medication-assisted treatment, so essentially, like, I think of these receptors, like little baseball mitts, and so heroin, opioids sitting on the receptor, there it is. And when it comes off after years of pain pill use or heroin use, and same with alcohol, and when it comes off, you have these empty receptors. And so it's a little bit of a stretch, but essentially those receptors are driving forces that lead to relapse, but also you feel like crap, and that will lead to relapse, but there's medical withdrawal that occurs. And so at least during the withdrawal process, medication-assisted treatment is essential. In fact, for benzodiazepines and alcohol, the studies show that we really have to utilize medication-assisted treatment to stabilize, to prevent things like seizures and other perilous issues. However, IV NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. That there are studies that are kind of in the works looking at treatment as usual for alcohol and benzo withdrawal versus IV NAD, which really help with the oxidative damage repair really quickly. Now, I work with folks that do IV NAD. Fantastic tool. I love it. I'm referring loads of patients. However, what I see is after 10 days of IV NAD, people come back confident. They don't have the therapeutic changes. They might have the neural changes, and they feel like last time they were sober for a year, they felt that advanced in their sobriety, but with their brain damage and their brain repair, but they don't have the habit changes. And so I see people come back from 10 days of IV NAD and they jump right back into their lifestyle because they feel like they can. And that they also have a tool. So it's a really fine balance to walk between the use of repair. And IV NAD is one of those repair mechanisms, but it takes a while to change habits. And with the opioid epidemic and fentanyl on the streets, I'm not having anyone that has had opiates in the past year in an abusive or an addictive fashion. I don't want anyone sitting in my office without kind of what I call like a helmet on the receptor. And that can be buprenorphine, which is a partial agonist, or the antagonist naltrexone.
Just for alcoholism, I'm often astonished that there are, here in New Orleans, I'm not sure if you've seen, there's a lot of functional alcoholics. We just have a culture where there's a ton of alcohol here. So, and you asked about drugs. There's a difference, obviously, between someone having 3-4 cocktails a night and heroin. Yeah. There just is absolutely a difference in chemistry and the damage. But naltrexone has been, I've just loved seeing how well that works. And I'll just put a plug in there for people to just look into that if they haven't. It's just a functional, it's a very safe treatment. We can tell you more about the biochemistry, but clinically it works fantastically.
I think that's fantastic. And I think that's really important. And I guess in the background, if you can work on rebuilding the sort of neurotransmitters and the building blocks and the gut and reducing the toxins while you put that sort of baseball mitt on the, on the, while you're protecting it with the drugs, then it makes, then you can really rebuild at the same time. And I think talking about the things that you mentioned in your book, part of the problem is a lot of this is expensive and time consuming. And I think that's a real challenge for a lot of people who are coming from very difficult life circumstances. They may have a lot of poverty, unemployment, stress, etc. Everything you name here is sort of in an ideal world, but how do you try to help people who really don't have these tools in their arsenal? What are the low-hanging fruits and the things that you would say are the most basic?
I'll give one. I'll put the spotlight on sleep. I think for so many patients, I think of sleep as a deficiency, and if they're not getting 8 hours, they need more. Their bodies are damaged or have an infectious burden or toxic burden. They need more time sleeping. And often simply just a few very simple, straightforward steps to restore the circadian rhythm that does not require any pills, supplements, medications makes such a profound difference in someone's mental health. Everything is better when these patients sleep. The average patient comes into me usually sleeping 6 or 6.5 hours a night. And often one of the very first things is I go through the very basics of sleep hygiene to get them at least to 8, because it's like the light bulb turns on. Their brain is able to start to heal. I think neurochemistry changes in a profound way, and anxiety will go down, depression will go down, all their pain will go down. Their body simply functions better. So making sure that they're getting 20 to 30 minutes of direct sun a day, which many of these chronically ill patients are not. They simply are not. Just having them walk in the sun, and then an hour before bed, turning off all lights to their ability, putting on blue light blocking glasses, and getting dark. It's restoring the blue in the day and the dark at night. It really, really makes such a profound shift, and it's free, right? There couldn't be anything easier than this. But convincing someone to do this and helping them is just one of those very low-hanging fruits that they almost always start with.
Excellent.
So I have a new way of addressing that digital therapeutic that's out that is a cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia that the doctor can track. So it's an FDA approved, and you'll see more of these coming down the pipeline, but it's an FDA approved digital therapeutic. So basically an app that I get a dashboard that I can actually see if my patient has interacted with it and how much. And so the change between that and me recommending them use Headspace, Calm app, Happify, or CBTI, which is CBT for insomnia, which is a great tool developed by the VA in the United States. That is a way for none of those I could track. And so the patients would just tell me, oh, I forgot. And they don't have any accountability for that. But this new, and I've just started using it, I will not prescribe a sleep med. I prescribe sleep meds all the time because I like Joe, it's imperative. But if the patient is not putting in the time to make the behavioral changes with sleep, then I will prescribe fewer sleep meds or will try to use some sort of alternative, and but this way I can track it.
That's
So
cool.
yeah, it's really great. It's hard. I have to remember to track it every week though, and then send them a note, but it's a great tool for accountability and for people to actually use it. It's FDA approved which means that it actually has, statistically significant efficacy, which we know that
And that's
therapy changes sleep.
And that's fantastic. I think one of the challenges, though, I mean, as someone who's suffered from many years of insomnia, is that sometimes not being able to sleep, despite practicing all this sleep hygiene religiously and taking sort of the right supplements, et cetera, and still not being able to sleep, can be one of the most sort of debilitating things. And then you're even more stressed because you think, oh, I know I should be sleeping and I can't. And then the other thing is that, as Arwen was saying, I mean, you have to track people's sleep. I mean, all this integrative approach takes quite a lot of effort. And I think sometimes, people who are suffering from addiction, they're very depleted in terms of, being able to implement these lifestyle changes, which are so important. And I think hence the use of pharmaceuticals to help. But it's, I'm just wondering in terms of, for instance, nutrition or meditation, like, is there anything else that you would say? And also my heart bleeds for people who are, struggling to do 3 or 4 jobs and have incredibly stressful life circumstances. So while sleep is super important and there are ways of getting that, I mean, what if you have to work and you're super anxious and you can't sleep? Or, are there other things that you would recommend people try? I mean, I think the sunlight trick is a really good one. And
Daily meditation of 20 minutes, I think, is one of the most effective ways that we can down-regulate our sympathetic nervous system. And that would be one. Adrenal adaptogens are a second helpful tool. Spaced throughout the day, I find really helpful for patients. But there comes a point where if you are spending tons of time, like it sounds like you were, trying to sleep despite really good hygienic practices, then it's very likely there's a cause for that. And so the question is, you need to each patient needs to really investigate with a good doctor, what's that cause? Is it an iron deficiency causing restless leg? Is it mold toxicity? You're waking up with panic in the middle of the night because you're sleeping in a moldy environment. Are you perimenopausal and your doctor never checked your LH and FSH? I mean, these are things that I see frequently, all the time is missed. And the list goes on and on.
Sure, thyroid, food insensitivities, and like you said, Kiki, all of those are very expensive to do a full workup. But for some real basics, especially those with health-minded, I had a patient the other day who she's been using heroin, very deep trauma from childhood, began using heroin at the age of 12 with a family member, and she's now in her 30s and has had an entire 1 year of sobriety in her entire adult life. Nevertheless, healthy as a horse, uses supplements, uses exercise, meditation, and she uses heroin for stress relief because of all of that deep-seated trauma. But the thing that she and I were talking about the other day was, what are the most important supplements that you would start with? And we, even without doing any blood work, because I know blood work, lab work is maybe not available to everybody all the time, I would always suggest inositol for sleep. anywhere from, which I definitely put in my book, anywhere from 4.5 to 9 grams, which it's a very high molecular weight. So 9 grams isn't that much. It's like 2 little itty bitty scoops. Magnesium, but the right kind of magnesium, because that can calm the nervous system down and help cellular functioning.
Which type?
It depends on the patient, but for people without GI issues, I tend to go with magnesium glycinate, which has a balance between addressing the periphery. And it also goes into the brain to help with anxiety management. It also helps stabilize if people have like heart flutters. That can help. The magnesium can help. It won't always help. And so inositol, magnesium, and a good vitamin B6. And then sometimes, actually, we're in a pandemic where we have this viral situation that we really want to put up our armament. And so vitamin D and zinc, and those are all very inexpensive. You can get those preferably at a pharmacy that has third-party testing brands, but those are not hard vitamins to screw up. Those are not hard to source. They're very inexpensive. So just what I said right now, if I'm certain I could find them and make it so it's less than $20 a month for all of those for somebody.
That's fantastic. And I think just listening to both of you, what really strikes me is the importance of this sort of 360 approach, because you can be healing somebody's biochemistry, but they'll still have this trauma, this childhood trauma, which if it remains unaddressed, will keep sort of damaging the biochemistry. And conversely, you can work with someone's trauma, but if they have biochemical imbalances such as food intolerances or mold toxicity, you can heal the trauma as much as you want. You're still going to have issues due to the biochemistry. So it's really important to deal with both. And one of the things also in your book, you were mentioning CBT and DBT as sort of go-to therapies that really work with addiction and these mental health issues. And I would like to add also the importance of sort of trauma work, whether it's somatic experiencing, the work of Peter Levine, Stephen Porges, Bessel van der Kolk, in terms of working with the body and with cellular memory, as opposed to simply cognitively approaching trauma. And I think that's a very important piece to do with the nervous system and dysregulation of the nervous system, which is really gaining traction and which is really important to combine with this more biochemical approach and also more cognitive therapies. Do you use these methods or do you find them helpful?
Yeah, I always think of an ex of mine that said he had a traumatic past, and he said, why do people like you think that people like me need to relive my past trauma? And I think heavily about that. And, I have trauma therapists in my office. They do EMDR. There's some great tools, but that really does, you have to bring people into their heavy limbic space before you can bring them out of it. Yes. That's where the somatic therapies are so profound. And I'm so glad they're gaining more traction because frankly, it's been hard we've had just a handful of somatic therapists here in Louisiana. And I know that it works great, but it's hard to find. So, and it's coming from England and Australia, actually, that we're having more and more studies on it. So I am all about somatic therapies. Emotional freedom technique is the one that I use most frequently because, frankly, it's available here. I have one colleague who is an excellent practitioner, and she does a group, which is amazing. Yeah. Joe?
I agree with all that. I found somatic experiencing to be really helpful for a number of patients. It should be more widely available, I think, than it is. But I think it's changing. The last tool I'll throw in for addressing trauma would be microcurrent therapy. Mm-hmm. There are a number of really excellent case studies showing improvement in veterans, Gulf War veterans, PTSD, using an 8-week program for microcurrent. I've run it just on one patient, but it was beneficial. And the advantage of microcurrent as a modality is that you have the current applied to you, and you don't have to relive the trauma necessarily. It's actually, frankly, quite relaxing. The patient is just kind of lying on the treatment table for 45 minutes. And so it's quite nice, but beneficial. It's gentle, and it works really well.
What's the difference between the microcurrent and sort of neurofeedback? I mean, I think they're quite different, but I'm curious about the microcurrent. Do you know more about the difference between the two?
So neurofeedback will imply that you have some sort of input coming in as a result of your treatment, whereas the microcurrent is simply a very, 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 very small current electrical therapy applied to the body. So you're not getting any response back.
Right.
Perhaps 20% of patients will feel euphoric or really positive as they're getting the treatment done. Most patients won't feel much of anything, and the current is so small that they may not even notice that the treatment is happening.
Just my final question, I think the way you both approach addiction and mental health issues is really the way that it should be approached. And I think, it's really important. Why do you think this is not more prevalent in the sort of mainstream medical environment? I mean, I think things are changing, but why do you think, where's the bottleneck and why is it not more prevalent? I believe that in 10 years it will be mainstream, but for now.
Because the vast majority of doctors are employed by insurance companies, meaning that even if they work for a hospital or a larger practice, they're being reimbursed by insurance companies, which dictates how they think and treat patients. And so there's a financial incentive to rush patients in every 15 minutes. And it's impossible to do any sort of good medical care, no matter your field, in 15 minutes. And I think that is the primary problem. It's not that these doctors are not smart or don't want to think about these things. It's not that they are not accomplished. It's just that they're practicing in a situation where the incentives are to rush patients through. And they wish it weren't so, but they get trapped into these contracts and don't see a way to be able to practice without taking insurance.
Well, and my workup is an hour and a half. Joe, your workup is 2 hours. We would not get reimbursed if patients were coming in on insurance only, because that is not what's allowed. I also know that until it's in the literature and in practice, it's not taught in medical school. And until it's taught in medical school, it's not in the literature and practice. And we have such a slow, medical school here is 4 years after your undergraduate, and then your residency from 3 to 5 years, and then your fellowships. And so we have like this it's, a 7 to 10 year training. And so then I come out of training, Joe comes out of training 7 years ago, 6 years ago, I come out of training 10 years ago. And now we can start, running our practices. And I teach at Tulane and LSU. I'm always asked to do grand rounds about exactly this subject. And the medical students and the residents are so hungry.
Love it. Yeah.
But they always say that they're not taught it. And so, and they can't learn it in medical school if there's nobody teaching it. So it's like a worm or a burrows. It's just a never-ending circle that we're going to continue being on this path until people like me and Joe break free and try and perpetuate it. And you, Kiki, by helping educate patients, because patients asking for stuff.
That's how things will change. Is patients listening to podcasts like this, learning and demanding more. It's the only way that things will change.
I've always said I really want to create a revolution from the ground up and educate people and raise awareness that there are better options out there that really do shift the needle, and that basically they are available. A few people are practicing, and to demand these from their doctors, because I think it's really essential.
And I think studies are important. There's so much, because of what we do is often not pharmaceutically based. Although we both use pharmaceuticals, but it's not pharmaceutically based necessarily. So there's not studies on what we do, because it takes a lot of money to raise to do a head-to-head trial, which is what the medical community will listen to. And so in functional medicine, we have, thousands and hundreds of thousands of anecdotes with personal experience and little studies comparing head-to-head. And so good news, I am probably working on some studies related to things like hyperbaric oxygen, and related to IV NAD, and related to cryotherapy. And there's the MAPS study, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And those are current active studies that are going on. And we're going to see I think a sea change is going to happen when these sorts of things get released widely.
Fantastic. Well, let's fingers crossed we can all continue working to that goal. And you know, both of you are doing such incredible work, and thank you. And now, if people want to find you both, I will put your information in our show notes, but can you just say your website and where people can find you?
Sure. My last name is Podesta, Podesta, and I am podestawellness.com. Perfect.
And Joe?
They can find me at drmather.com, which is DOCTORMATHER.
Thank you both so much for your time. You've both been amazing. And I must say, people in Louisiana are very lucky to have access to you. And I'm sure that people from around the world are going to be wishing that they had access to you. So thank you very much for your time, and keep up your really important, wonderful work.
Thank you for the work you do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Mind Health 360 show. I hope that we've helped you realize that mental health symptoms have root causes that can and need to be addressed in order to sustainably heal, and have given you some ideas about steps you, your loved ones, or clients may take to start their healing journey. Please share this interview with anyone you think may find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with our latest interviews on integrative mental health. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. This information is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or to replace medical advice. Please always consult your healthcare practitioner before discontinuing any medication or implementing any changes in your diet, lifestyle, or supplement program.